How does one become a successful mayor of 21st century New York City? It helps to have ambitious plans to lower the city's carbon emissions, balance the budget, reform the education system, improve public health, and expand the city's parks. It also helps to have business credentials and an independent streak that leaves you unbeholden to either political party. But perhaps most importantly, it would be very convenient to do all of these things while also being the 8th richest person on planet Earth. This is a brief summary of the mayoralty of Michael Bloomberg. Section 1. How the Wealth Was Won. Michael Bloomberg was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1942 on Valentine's Day. His father was the son of a Russian immigrant and a bookkeeper for a dairy company. From these humble beginnings, Bloomberg attended Johns Hopkins University, where he paid for his tuition through student loans and his job as a parking lot attendant. He graduated in 1964 with a BS in electrical engineering. 1 year later, Bloomberg donated $5 to his alma mater. That would ultimately represent 1/300 millionth of the total amount he would give to Johns Hopkins over the next half-century. He then matriculated to Harvard Business School as a Master of Business Administration. He graduated in 1966. Not long thereafter, he moved to New York City, where he got his first job on Wall Street with Salomon Brothers. By 1973, he had become general partner at the bank, where he headed equity trading and systems development. The bank was eventually bought out by Fibro Corporation, and Bloomberg was laid off, but not before being given $10 million in his severance package. He used that money to create a new company called Innovative Market Systems, which developed computerized financial systems to provide market data and financial analytics in real time. Merrill Lynch invested $30 million in the company, which was eventually renamed Bloomberg LP. Bloomberg LP went on to develop other products, including Bloomberg Tradebook, the Bloomberg Messaging Service, and the Bloomberg Newswire. As the company approached the new millennium, its value grew exponentially, and by 2001, its founder and CEO was worth $5 billion. That amount of money can be used for a number of purposes, including, for example, self-funding a campaign for mayor of New York City. Section 2. Rebuild this city. Despite being a lifelong member of the Democratic Party, Michael Bloomberg ran for mayor of New York City in 2001 as a Republican. Despite his success in business, Bloomberg began the campaign as a distinct underdog. Democrats outnumbered Republicans 5-1 in the city, and after 8 years of Republican Rudy Giuliani in office, it stood to reason that the next mayor of New York would almost certainly be a Democrat. In other words, it would have taken extraordinary circumstances for a Republican to be elected, no matter what the results of the mayoral primary on September 11, 2001. Of course, there were no results to be had that day. After the attacks, the primaries were rescheduled. Bloomberg won the Republican primary, but the Democratic primary went to a runoff, further delaying the general election. By the time public advocate Mark Green won the Democratic primary on October 11, 2001, Bloomberg had already been campaigning for 2 weeks, and Green had endured a difficult primary with Bronx Borough President Fernando Ferrer. From there, Mayor Giuliani, whose popularity had skyrocketed after the September 11th attacks, endorsed Bloomberg, giving him an additional boost. But perhaps the greatest advantage Bloomberg had in his pocket was his wallet. He spent $74 million of his own money on direct mail and TV ads, which was a record at the time for a non-presidential campaign. With virtually unlimited ad dollars, Bloomberg was able to fund all of the basic necessities of his campaign, as well as ads which specifically targeted vital demographics, such as this one which targeted Latinos who largely supported Ferrer in the Democratic primary.
Mejor candidato para lograr esto es Mike Bloomberg. Bloomberg con su empresa es un líder en las tecnologías de hoy y un excelente hombre de negocios.
Ultimately, with all of these forces working to Bloomberg's advantage, he managed to win the 2001 mayoral election, but only barely. He picked up 50.3% of the vote compared to Green's 47.9%. He got fewer votes than Green in Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn, but made up for it with a solid victory in Queens and over 70% of the vote in Staten Island. After arriving in office, Bloomberg made his priorities clear in his State of the City address. In the wake of an incredibly debilitating attack, Bloomberg not only advocated for rebuilding, but also for growth beyond that. After reflecting on the way that New York had already begun to heal from September 11th, Bloomberg declared, "Though we must start by rebuilding Lower Manhattan, that's only a start. We must stimulate economic growth across the city. We must modernize the management of government. We must renew our waterfront. And we must reform our school system. And we must be ever vigilant to make sure New York continues to be the safest large city in the nation." And with that, Bloomberg established what would become a recurring theme of his mayoralty, going above and beyond fixing the city's problems by enacting aspirational policy. To rebuild would not be enough. As with Bloomberg LP, Mike sought for this project to have exponential growth. And despite his position as a barely elected Republican mayor, Bloomberg made some politically unpalatable decisions, including a restaurant and bar smoking ban in 2002. The decision wasn't meant to shore up voters, nor did it fulfill the desires of a special interest. After all, the only special interest Bloomberg was beholden to was himself. And his vision of a happy, healthy New York didn't involve people smoking indoors. Ultimately, though, the smoking ban grew in popularity after its implementation. The same could not be said of Bloomberg's push for New York to host the Republican National Convention. New Yorkers protested the convention, which nominated the highly unpopular President George W. Bush, and were arrested in mass numbers, many of which were detained in an NYPD facility that was later described as New York's own little Guantanamo on the Hudson. Civil rights lawsuits followed and took over a decade to be settled for over $35 million. It would have been so easy, politically, for Michael Bloomberg to avert this whole crisis by not advocating for the RNC to come to New York. But like every other measure he took, it was part of his vision for the city. Politics be damned. Section 3. Public health, public schools, public space. By the time Bloomberg sought re-election in 2005, he had garnered a reputation as a pragmatic managerial mayor who could look at problems from the perspective of a businessman and make statistical, results-based decisions. Of course, that same background gave him a reputation as a distant, elitist technocrat who was not in touch with the people. Still, after spending tens of millions of dollars on his re-election campaign, Bloomberg was re-elected with 58% of the vote, winning in every borough except the Bronx, which was won by Fernando Ferrer. Upon re-election, Bloomberg continued his efforts to increase efficiency above all. After inheriting a New York budget in crisis, Bloomberg made big expense cuts and raised taxes in order to balance the budget. By the time his second term rolled around, the economy was strong enough to result in a yearly budget surplus for the city. Bloomberg utilized that economic growth to continue his efforts to help the city's brand. These included pushes to improve public health, public schools, and public space. Having already instituted his smoking ban, Bloomberg turned his sights to a more insidious source of New York's health problems: food. In 2005, New York forced restaurants and food vendors to phase out artificial trans fats. And later, Bloomberg's administration mandated that food service providers have calorie counts on menus. Again, whether you viewed these as necessary public health initiatives or invasive requirements from the nanny state, Bloomberg didn't care. In fact, when discussing in Time magazine whether he was afraid of backing controversial measures, he said, quote, "I don't care. I take great pride in being willing to stand up." Bloomberg also made great strides to reform New York's public school system. He abolished the Board of Education and replaced it with the Department of Education. He advocated for after-school and summer school programs, enforced a cell phone ban in city classrooms, and negotiated deals with the teachers' unions, including increasing the salaries of teachers in exchange for their surrendering of certain benefits. But the most distinctive element of Bloomberg's public education policy was the incentivizing of improved standardized test scores. While Bloomberg touted a decrease in the achievement gap between Black and Latino students and white and Asian students on standardized tests, teachers' unions and parents felt that his regulations resulted in teaching to the test, rather than an actual improvement in education. In fact, Bloomberg was so focused on the notion of improving teacher performance that he once proposed that if he could design the education system from the ground up, he would cut the number of teachers in half and double their compensation, claiming that, quote, "double the class size with a better teacher is a good deal for the students." For all the credit he received for his efforts to improve education, he continued to undermine himself with overly calculated, out-of-touch rhetoric. Yet another effort of Bloomberg's that came into full swing during his second term as mayor was his revamping of public spaces. Bloomberg pushed for the construction of new parks, including the High Line and Brooklyn Bridge Park, and for the return of Governor's Island from the state to New York City. But other changes he made to public spaces raised some eyebrows. Bloomberg was responsible for spearheading expensive public art installations, including the Gates in Central Park in 2005 and New York City waterfalls along the East River in 2008. These two installations alone cost over $30 million, although they were funded by artists and benefactors respectively. New Yorkers questioned the necessity of these pieces, with some mocking the Gates in particular as an eyesore. Then, in early 2009, Bloomberg announced that traffic lanes along Broadway from 42nd to 47th Street would be transformed into pedestrian plazas, which Bloomberg proposed would reduce pollution, cut down on pedestrian accidents, and help traffic flow more smoothly. But the seats originally put out were inexpensive plastic chairs which were easily broken. Such was the idiosyncratic nature of Bloomberg's efforts. As a billionaire with a vision for New York, he could put forward extraordinary proposals with high costs, confident that they would pay off dividends. But as a shrewd businessman, he reined in the city's budget by refusing to spring for sturdier chairs and shrugging off the notion of increased class sizes. As the end of his second term approached, Bloomberg was simultaneously an admirable and infuriating advocate for the city. Section 4. Here we go again. Again. By the middle of his second term, Bloomberg's approval rating sat consistently above 70%. It looked as though he would leave office as a popular mayor who successfully utilized his business acumen to improve the government. But then in late 2008, in the midst of a financial crisis and months of speculation about his future, Michael Bloomberg announced that he was seeking a change in city legislation to extend mayoral term limits to 3 from 2, allowing him to run for re-election again. He cited the financial crisis as a justification for this move, even though term limits were not extended for Rudy Giuliani after 9/11. And even though he was highly popular at the time, many New Yorkers did not take kindly to what they felt was a shady revising of the rules.
And no one respects term limits like Diamond Mike Bloomberg.
Public wants term limits. Deliberately saying to the public, we don't care what you think, is, I would use the word disgraceful.
Oh, would you? You can imagine what he said this year when the city council tried to introduce another bill to do the same thing.
If the council passes it, I will sign it, and I would plan to run for re-election.
Because I'm disgraceful.
Ultimately, New Yorkers re-elected Bloomberg again, but this time by a much narrower margin, 50.7% to 46.3%. Thus, Bloomberg entered his third term under inauspicious circumstances. A typical politician would have avoided pushing any controversial measures in such a political climate. So, naturally, Mayor Bloomberg brought out a soda ban. On May 30th, 2012, Bloomberg announced the portion cap rule, which would have prevented food service establishments from selling sodas larger than 16 ounces in New York. This continued Bloomberg's trend of instituting regulations for public health after the smoking ban and trans fat ban. But for the typical New Yorker, once again, Bloomberg had seemed to have overreached his power.
What are you doing? We already let you make up a third term as mayor. Put cameras on every intersection, and for some reason, picnic tables in the middle of 7th Avenue? What the is that? This is all we have left!
Ultimately, the ban was overturned by the New York Court of Appeals and served mostly as a drag on Mayor Bloomberg's approval ratings. Plus, his laser-focused, numbers-based approach to developing the city had its unpopular permutations. He was a strong proponent of the stop-and-frisk laws that had first been implemented under Rudy Giuliani. In 2013, a U.S. District Court judge ruled that the city's implementation of stop-and-frisk was unconstitutional, disproportionately targeting people of color. Earlier that year, Bloomberg argued that based on crime statistics, he felt that laws disproportionately targeted white people. This contributed to the ever-growing perception that while Bloomberg knew how to run a business, he lacked the empathy necessary to fully understand the plight of the people behind the statistics. Ultimately, Bloomberg left office with a 49% approval rating. While not terrible, that number was a far cry from the 70% approval he enjoyed at the peak of his second term. What's more, he was succeeded by a Democrat, Bill de Blasio, who earned over 73% of the vote, ending a 5-election streak of Republican or Republican-affiliated candidates winning the mayoralty of New York. Section 5. Something's missing. Michael Bloomberg was succeeded by a candidate that took advantage of the frustration with his distant, elitist appearance. But since then, de Blasio has fallen out of favor with a number of New Yorkers, with his approval ratings dropping into the low 40s, remarkably low for a Democratic mayor of the city. This raises questions about whether Bloomberg's legacy might ultimately be viewed favorably by New Yorkers, even after his tumultuous third term. His tenure was characterized by decisions that defied the political spectrum. He increased public spending through ambitious public works projects, but he managed to balance the budget at the same time. He was chastised by conservatives as the purveyor of a nanny state in the midst of his public health initiatives, but they seemed to have no problem with his continuation of the invasive stop-and-frisk policy. He positioned himself as a national figure by co-founding Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and yet was in some ways such a local creature that he was accused of focusing too much on Manhattan and not the outer boroughs. The simple truth is, Bloomberg's wealth allowed him to be such an unconventional, independent mayor. He could not be bought. If anything, he was able to buy New York. No other New York mayor in history could afford to spend over $100 per vote. Nor did any other New York mayor have such deep business ties as to be able to subsidize the projects he wanted made through his wealthy friends. But Bloomberg was also able to demonstrate genuine interest in improving the greater good of New York by foregoing his salary when he could have been maximizing his profits at Bloomberg LP. Time and money are both valuable, and often in short supply. Bloomberg gave both to his efforts as mayor. He may be a nanny-state elitist out-of-touch technocrat, but he's New York's nanny-state elitist out-of-touch technocrat, who has consistently demonstrated a desire to give back to his community, even if the community thinks it doesn't want his help.